Hey guys, tonight we're sailing back to the year 1492 and following the long and uncertain voyage of Christopher Columbus, the man whose journey across the Atlantic changed the course of world history forever. Imagine standing on a wooden ship with no modern maps, no GPS, and no certainty that land even exists beyond the endless horizon. The sea stretches in every direction. Waves crash against the hull, and the crew grows more nervous with each passing day. Columbus believed he could reach Asia by sailing west from Europe. Many people doubted him, but after years of asking kings and queens for support, he finally convinced Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain to fund his expedition. 3 ships were prepared for the voyage: the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa María letters in August 1492. The small fleet left Spain and headed into waters few Europeans dared to cross. At first the journey seemed calm, but as the days turned into weeks, the sailors became frightened. The wind carried them farther from home than they had ever travelled before. Some feared sea monsters, while others worried they would run out of food and water. Columbus remained determined and promised that land was ahead. The crew watched birds flying overhead and floating branches drifting in the ocean, hoping these signs meant a coastline was near. Still, day after day, nothing appeared except endless blue water. Tension spread across the ships. Some sailors reportedly discussed turning back to Spain. Columbus knew that if he failed, his dream would be over. Then, during the night of October 11th, a sailor aboard the Pinta spotted a distant light. Excitement rushed through the fleet. A few hours later, at dawn on October 12, 1492, land finally appeared on the horizon. The exhausted sailors cheered as they approached a small island in the Caribbean. Columbus stepped onto the shore believing he had reached islands near Asia, not realizing he had arrived in a part of the world unknown to most Europeans. The beaches were bright, the water was clear, and local people watched the newcomers with curiosity. Columbus claimed the land for Spain and began exploring nearby islands. He searched for gold, valuable trade routes, and signs of the great cities of Asia he expected to find. Instead, he encountered entirely new cultures and lands unlike anything he had imagined. Columbus soon realized that these islands contained people, languages, and traditions unfamiliar to Europeans. He was amazed by the warm climate, tropical forests, and villages scattered along the coast. The local inhabitants welcomed the visitors in many places, offering food, water, and gifts. Columbus carefully observed everything he saw and recorded details in his journal. He remained convinced that he was somewhere near Asia and believed larger cities and great riches must exist nearby. Determined to find them, he continued sailing from island to island. During the expedition, the ships explored parts of what are now the Bahamas, Cuba, and Hispaniola. The sailors searched rivers, coastlines, and settlements hoping to discover gold. Stories about precious metals encouraged Columbus to keep moving forward. Yet the voyage was far from easy. Storms threatened the ships. Supplies had to be carefully managed, and the crews often struggled with exhaustion. Then disaster struck. On Christmas Day 1492, the Santa María ran aground on a reef and could not be saved. It was the largest ship of the expedition, and losing it created a serious problem, since there was not enough room on the remaining vessels for everyone. Columbus ordered a small settlement to be built using timber from the wreck. The outpost was named La Navidad. A group of men stayed behind while Columbus prepared to return to Spain with the surviving ships. Early in 1493, he began the long journey home. The Atlantic was dangerous during winter, and violent storms scattered the vessels. For a time, Columbus feared he might never reach Europe again. He reportedly wrote a summary of his discoveries, sealed it in a container, and cast it into the sea in hopes that news of the voyage would survive, even if the ships did not. Fortunately, the expedition endured the rough weather and eventually reached Spain. News of the journey spread rapidly across the kingdom. Crowds gathered to hear stories about distant islands, unfamiliar peoples, and lands beyond the Atlantic Ocean. Columbus was welcomed with great honour by the Spanish monarchs. What had started as a risky gamble had become one of the most famous voyages in history. Many people celebrated him as a hero who had opened a new route across the ocean. Yet this was only the beginning. Columbus believed even greater discoveries awaited him, and before long he would organise another expedition far larger than the first, carrying hundreds of settlers, soldiers, and sailors back across the Atlantic toward the lands he had only begun to explore. The success of the first voyage transformed Columbus into one of the most famous men in Europe. With the support of the Spanish crown, he quickly organised a second expedition. This time the mission was much larger. Instead of 3 small ships, a fleet of 17 vessels crossed the Atlantic carrying settlers, soldiers, craftsmen, animals, seeds, and supplies. The goal was no longer simply exploration. Spain wanted permanent settlements, wealth, and influence in the newly reached lands. In September 1493, the fleet departed and followed a route that Columbus now knew could lead safely across the ocean. After weeks at sea, the ships arrived in the Caribbean once again. Columbus eagerly travelled to La Navidad, the settlement left behind during his first voyage. What he found shocked him. The settlement had been destroyed and none of the men remained alive. The dream of a peaceful outpost had collapsed. Columbus decided a new colony would have to be established elsewhere. A settlement called La Isabela was founded and became one of the first European towns in the Americas. Life there proved difficult. Food shortages, disease, hard labour, and disagreements created constant problems. Many settlers had expected easy riches, but instead faced exhausting work and unfamiliar conditions. Columbus continued searching for gold and exploring surrounding regions. He sailed along coastlines, mapped islands, and claimed more territory for Spain. Despite these efforts, tensions grew among both settlers and local communities. Reports sent back to Europe often described hardships rather than the fortune many had imagined. Columbus still insisted that Asia must be nearby. He explored parts of Cuba and became convinced he was approaching the edge of the Asian continent. His confidence never fully disappeared, even though the lands around him did not match the descriptions found in European books about Asia. Over the following years, he completed additional voyages across the Atlantic. Each expedition revealed more islands, coastlines, and opportunities for Spanish expansion. Yet Columbus also faced increasing criticism. Some colonists complained about his leadership, while royal officials questioned how the settlements were being managed. The explorer who had once returned in triumph now found himself defending his reputation. Nevertheless, the voyages had already changed history. Regular travel between Europe and the Americas had begun. Ships would continue crossing the Atlantic carrying people, goods, animals, plants, and ideas in both directions. Entire empires would rise because of these connections, although Columbus never fully understood that he had encountered continents unknown to most Europeans. His journeys opened a new chapter in world history, one whose consequences would be felt across oceans and generations for centuries to come. As the years passed, Columbus became increasingly determined to prove that his discoveries would bring enormous wealth to Spain. He believed that somewhere beyond the islands there must be great cities filled with gold, spices, and valuable trade goods. In 1498 he launched his third voyage and sailed farther south than before. During this expedition he reached the coast of South America near the mouth of the Orinoco River. The amount of fresh water flowing into the ocean amazed him. Such a powerful river seemed impossible to come from a small island. For a moment Columbus suspected he had discovered a vast new land. Yet he still struggled to abandon his belief that he was near Asia while he explored. Conditions in the colonies continued to worsen. Settlers complained about shortages, conflicts, and poor administration. Arguments became so serious that the Spanish crown sent an official to investigate. When the investigator arrived, he found widespread unrest. Columbus and his brothers were accused of mismanagement and abuse of authority. In a dramatic turn of events, the famous explorer was arrested. Chains were placed on his wrists, and he was sent back to Spain. The sight shocked many people who remembered the celebrations that had greeted him after his first voyage. Although Queen Isabella ordered the chains removed and restored some of his privileges, Columbus never fully regained the power and influence he once enjoyed. Still, he refused to give up. In 1502 he embarked on a fourth and final voyage. His goal was to find a passage through the newly discovered lands that would lead directly to Asia. He explored parts of Central America, including coastlines of present-day Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. The journey was extremely difficult. Violent storms battered the ships, wood-eating sea creatures damaged the hulls, and supplies ran dangerously low. At one point the expedition became stranded in Jamaica for many months. The crew survived only through careful planning and occasional assistance from local communities. Columbus used his knowledge of an upcoming lunar eclipse to impress local leaders and encourage them to continue providing food. Eventually, rescue ships arrived and carried the exhausted sailors home. Columbus returned to Spain in poor health. Years of travel, hardship, and disappointment had taken their toll. He spent his final years trying to recover titles, rewards, and recognition that he believed he had earned. Yet many of his requests were never fully granted. In 1506, Christopher Columbus died, believing he had reached the outskirts of Asia. He never realized that his voyages had connected Europe to continents previously unknown to most Europeans, and had forever altered the course of world history. His name would be remembered for centuries, praised by some, criticized by others, but never forgotten. After Columbus died, The world continued to change because of the routes he had opened across the Atlantic. Ships from Spain began arriving in greater numbers, carrying settlers, explorers, merchants, priests, and soldiers. What had started as a single risky expedition gradually became a constant flow of travel between Europe and the Americas. New settlements appeared on islands and coastlines. Maps that once showed a vast empty ocean slowly filled with newly recorded lands, rivers, mountains, and ports. European cartographers worked to understand the geography of these distant territories. As more explorers sailed west, many began to realize that the lands Columbus had reached were not Asia at all. They were part of continents unknown to most Europeans. The realization changed how people viewed the world. For centuries, many had believed they understood the shape and size of the known world. But the discoveries across the Atlantic revealed how much remained unexplored. Trade expanded rapidly. Crops, animals, and goods moved between continents on a scale never seen before. Horses, cattle, and wheat travelled from Europe to the Americas, while foods such as potatoes, tomatoes, maize, and cacao eventually spread across Europe and beyond. These exchanges transformed diets, economies, and daily life for millions of people. At the same time, the arrival of Europeans brought enormous challenges and suffering to many indigenous communities. Diseases previously unknown in the Americas spread quickly and had devastating effects. Conflicts over land, resources, and power reshaped entire regions. Historians continue to study these events because their consequences were so profound and long-lasting. Columbus himself became a symbol whose reputation changed over time. In some periods he was celebrated as a brave explorer who crossed an ocean that many feared. Monuments were built, cities were named after him, and stories of his voyage were taught around the world. In other periods, people focused more closely on the hardships and injustices that followed European expansion. As a result, discussions about Columbus became more complex. Today, historians often examine both his remarkable navigation and the wider impact of the age of exploration that followed. Yet one fact remains undeniable. When 3 small ships left Spain in 1492, few could have imagined how greatly that voyage would influence the future. The journey connected distant parts of the world and helped begin an era of global exploration, unlike anything that had come before. From a sailor staring across an endless horizon to a figure remembered centuries later, Christopher Columbus became one of the most influential and controversial explorers in human history, leaving behind a legacy that continues to be debated and studied to this very day. To understand why Columbus's voyage became so important, it helps to imagine the world as Europeans saw it before. 1492, travel was slow. Information moved gradually, and large parts of the globe remained a mystery. Merchants searched for valuable spices, silk, and luxury goods from Asia. But existing trade routes were long, expensive, and often dangerous. Kingdoms competed fiercely for wealth and influence. Every ruler hoped to discover a faster route to the riches of the East. Columbus believed he had found the answer. although he underestimated the true size of the Earth and misunderstood the geography between Europe and Asia. His determination pushed him to attempt a journey that many considered impossible. His success encouraged other explorers to take similar risks. Within a few decades, ships from several European countries were crossing oceans in search of new opportunities. Exploration entered a new age. Ports grew busier, shipbuilding improved, and navigation techniques became more advanced. Sailors learned to travel farther than previous generations could have imagined. Stories of distant lands inspired adventurers, merchants, and scholars alike. People wanted to know what existed beyond every horizon. The discoveries also sparked intense competition among European powers. Spain, Portugal, England, France, and others sought territory, trade, and influence overseas. Expeditions followed one another across the Atlantic and around the world. Some explorers searched for gold, others for trade routes, and some simply for knowledge. Columbus had not intended to start such a transformation, yet his voyage helped trigger it. Over time, books were written about his travels. Artists painted scenes from his journeys, and historians debated his achievements. Some described him as a visionary navigator willing to challenge accepted ideas. Others argued that the consequences of exploration brought suffering as well as opportunity. Because of these differing views, Columbus remains one of the most discussed figures in world history. What makes his story so fascinating is that it combines courage, ambition, uncertainty, success, and controversy all at once. A man with a bold idea convinced a royal court to support him, crossed an ocean that seemed endless, and reached lands that would reshape global history. Few individuals have had such a lasting impact on how continents interacted with one another more than 5 centuries later. The image of the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa María still captures the imagination. Their voyage reminds us that history can change because of a single decision to sail beyond the edge of the known world and keep moving forward when no one knows what lies ahead. Even centuries after the voyage, historians continue examining the details of Columbus's journey to better understand what actually happened aboard those small ships. Life at sea in the 15th century was far more difficult than most people imagine today. Sailors slept in cramped spaces, food often spoiled during long voyages, and fresh water could become scarce. There were no weather forecasts, no engines, and no reliable way to contact anyone on land. Every storm carried the possibility of disaster. The crews depended on wind, experience, and hope. During the crossing of the Atlantic, Columbus carefully recorded distances and observations in his journal. Some historians believe he occasionally reported shorter distances to the crew than he actually calculated, perhaps to reduce fear and prevent panic. Whether entirely true or not, the story reflects a real challenge he faced. The longer the ships remained at sea without finding land, the more nervous the sailors became. Maintaining confidence was almost as important as navigating the ocean itself. When land finally appeared, relief spread through the expedition. Yet the moment was not simply the end of a voyage. It was the beginning of an entirely new period of contact between distant societies. News travelled back to Europe with remarkable speed for the time. Merchants imagined new markets, Rulers imagined new territories, and explorers imagined new adventures. Across the continent, curiosity about the Western Ocean increased dramatically. The success of the expedition demonstrated that long-distance voyages across the Atlantic were possible and could be repeated. This realization changed strategic thinking throughout Europe. Kingdoms invested more heavily in ships, navigation, and overseas exploration. Young sailors dreamed of finding lands and riches of their own. Over time, exploration expanded far beyond the Caribbean. Expeditions reached North America, South American Ocean, and eventually circled the globe. Columbus never witnessed many of these later achievements, but his voyage helped create the conditions that made them possible. Today, museums preserve artifacts from the era. Scholars analyze surviving documents, and visitors travel to historic sites connected to the expedition. The story continues to attract attention because it sits at the meeting point of adventure and consequence. It is a tale of ambition, uncertainty, and discovery, but also a story whose effects reached far beyond the expectations of the people involved. The sailors who stepped onto the decks in 1492 could not have known that future generations would still be discussing their voyage more than 500 years later, studying every detail and debating its meaning in the larger story of human history. One of the most interesting parts of the Columbus story is how much uncertainty surrounded the world during his lifetime. Today, a person can open a map on a phone and see nearly every coastline on Earth within seconds. In the 15th century, however, large portions of the globe remained unknown to Europeans. Maps often contained blank spaces, guesses, and even illustrations of strange creatures in distant waters. The ocean beyond familiar routes seemed mysterious and intimidating. Many sailors preferred to remain close to known coastlines rather than venture into open seas. Columbus was different. He spent years studying navigation, geography, and travel accounts from merchants and explorers. He believed the distance to Asia by sailing west was much shorter than it actually was. His calculations were incorrect, but they gave him confidence to attempt a voyage that others considered unrealistic. In a strange way, his mistake helped make the expedition possible. Had he known the true distance between Europe and Asia across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, he might never have attempted the journey at all. Fate placed continents between his starting point and intended destination. As historians look back, they often note how small decisions can influence enormous events. If a storm had sunk the ships, if the crew had forced a return to Spain, or if Columbus had failed to gain royal support, history might have unfolded very differently. Instead, the expedition succeeded just enough to inspire further voyagers. Over time, the Atlantic Ocean changed from a barrier into a major route connecting continents. Ports expanded, trade increased, and communication between distant regions became more common. New ideas, technologies, foods, and cultures crossed oceans in both directions. These developments reshaped economies and societies around the world. Columbus did not create all of these changes by himself, but his voyage became one of the events that helped set them in motion. This is why historians continue to study him. His story is not only about one explorer or one expedition. It is about a turning point when different parts of the world became more connected than ever before. The journey began with 3 ships disappearing beyond the horizon and ended with consequences that reached across centuries. Few people who watched the vessels leave Spain in 1492 could have imagined that the voyage would become one of the most famous expeditions in human history, remembered long after the sailors, kings, and explorers of that era had passed into legend. As the centuries passed, the legend of Columbus continued to grow. Schools taught his story, writers described his voyages, and artists imagined dramatic scenes of ships crossing enormous waves beneath dark skies. Yet historians gradually learned that the real story was even more complicated than the legends. Original journals, letters, and royal documents revealed the challenges, fears, and uncertainties faced by everyone involved. They showed that exploration was rarely a straight path from success to success. Instead, it was filled with mistakes, disagreements, unexpected discoveries, and difficult decisions. Columbus himself experienced moments of triumph and moments of disappointment. He achieved fame few explorers ever reached. But he also faced criticism, investigations, and setbacks. This combination makes his life especially interesting to study. It reminds us that historical figures were real people living in uncertain times rather than characters who already knew how events would unfold. Modern researchers also examine the technology available during the voyage. Navigation instruments were simple compared with modern equipment. Sailors relied on the stars, the position of the sun, compasses, and experience gained from previous journeys. Determining exact location on the open ocean was extremely difficult. Despite these limitations, crews managed to cross vast distances and return home with valuable information. Their achievements required patience, courage, and skill. The Atlantic crossing that once seemed almost unimaginable gradually became more familiar as knowledge increased. Future generations improved maps and recorded coastlines with greater accuracy. Explorers built upon what earlier voyages had learned. In this way, every expedition contributed to a growing understanding of the world. Columbus's journeys became part of that larger process. Today, his name appears in history books across many countries because his voyage marked an important chapter in the age of exploration. Whether people view him mainly as a navigator, an explorer, or a controversial historical figure, his impact remains impossible to ignore. More than 500 years later, researchers still debate his decisions, analyse his writings, and discuss the consequences of his travels. The fact that these conversations continue after so much time demonstrates how significant the voyage was. A handful of ships set sail seeking a route to Asia, but instead became connected to one of the most influential turning points in world history. The ocean they crossed remains the same, yet the world that emerged afterward was profoundly different from the one they left behind when they first sailed west into the unknown. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Columbus's story is how it demonstrates the power of belief and persistence. For years he travelled from court to court seeking support for his plan. Many advisors rejected his proposal. Some thought the voyage was too dangerous while others doubted his calculations. It would have been easy to abandon the dream and return to a more ordinary life. Instead, Columbus continued, presenting his idea until he finally found rulers willing to take a chance on it. That determination became one of the defining features of his life, even when storms threatened his ships or when crews grew fearful. He pushed forward toward a destination that existed mostly in his imagination. History is filled with people who possessed bold ideas, but only a small number managed to convince others to follow them into uncertainty. Columbus was one of those individuals. At the same time, his story illustrates how success can create consequences far beyond anyone's expectations. When he stepped ashore in the Caribbean, he believed he had found islands near Asia. He could not have known that future generations would view the voyage as a turning point in global history. The explorers, sailors, and rulers involved were focused on the concerns of their own time trade, wealth, navigation, and national prestige. Yet the results of their actions reached far into the future. Historians often describe moments like this as historical crossroads, points at which events begin moving in new directions. The Voyage of 1492 became one of those moments. It influenced exploration, trade, politics, migration, and cultural exchange for centuries afterward. Even today, students learn about the expedition because it helps explain how the modern world developed. Museums display replicas of the ships. Documentaries retell the story. And researchers continue uncovering new details from surviving records. Every generation asks fresh questions about the voyage and its meaning. Some focus on navigation and exploration, while others examine the broader human consequences that followed. Together, these perspectives create a fuller understanding of the past. In the end, Columbus remains a figure who cannot be easily placed into a single category. He was an ambitious navigator, a determined dreamer, a controversial leader, and a participant in events that transformed the world. His voyage began as a search for a western route to Asia, but something much larger, he said, altered the course of history and ensured that the name Christopher Columbus would be remembered long after. The sails of the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa María disappeared beyond the horizon. Long after Columbus's lifetime, people continued searching for the exact reasons his voyage succeeded when so many others failed. Part of the answer lies in preparation. Before sailing west, Columbus spent years gathering information from sailors, merchants, and navigators who travelled across the Atlantic and along the coast of Africa. He studied winds and currents as carefully as possible. Although many of his geographical assumptions were wrong, he possessed valuable practical knowledge about seafaring. One of the advantages that helped his expedition was the pattern of Atlantic winds. Ships sailing west could use steady trade winds that pushed them across the ocean. On the return journey, different wind systems farther north helped carry vessels back toward Europe. This natural cycle eventually became the foundation of regular transatlantic travel. At the time, however, few people fully understood it. Columbus learned enough from experience and observation to make use of these conditions. Luck also played a role. Exploration has always depended partly on circumstances beyond human control. Favourable weather, healthy crews, and the absence of catastrophic storms all contributed to the outcome. A single major disaster might have changed everything. Because the expedition succeeded, news spread throughout Europe and encouraged further investment in exploration. Wealthy sponsors became more willing to fund voyages. Sailors became more willing to take risks. Kingdoms became more eager to compete for overseas influence. In this way, one successful expedition inspired many others. Historians often compare the voyage to the opening of a new chapter in a book whose ending no one could yet see. The first pages revealed only a glimpse of what was to come. Over the following decades, explorers charted coastlines, crossed new oceans, and connected distant regions in ways that had previously seemed impossible. Columbus did not accomplish all of this himself, but his journey became one of the events that accelerated the process. Even the ships from the first voyage became famous. The names Niña, Pinta, and Santa María are remembered centuries later because they carried ordinary sailors into extraordinary circumstances. Most of the men aboard could never have imagined that their voyage would be discussed hundreds of years in the future. They were simply trying to survive the ocean, follow orders and read land. Yet their experience became part of one of history's most enduring stories. The tale continues to fascinate because it combines adventure, mystery, determination, and consequence, showing how a voyage undertaken by a small fleet could eventually influence the lives of millions of people across the world. Another reason the story of Columbus has survived for so many centuries is that it captures a universal human desire to explore the unknown. Throughout history, people have looked beyond familiar horizons and wondered what lies farther away. Long before airplanes, satellites, or digital maps existed, oceans represented some of the greatest mysteries on Earth, too. Sail into waters where few people had travelled required enormous courage. Every sunrise revealed a horizon that looked exactly like the one before it. Day after day, the crew saw nothing but sea and sky. It is difficult for modern people to imagine that level of isolation. There were no messages from home, no weather reports, and no certainty about what waited ahead. In such conditions, leadership became crucial. Columbus had to maintain discipline, settle disputes, and keep the expedition focused on its objective. Even when fear spread among the sailors, the voyage continued westward. Historians often point out that exploration is not only about discovering new places, it is also about managing uncertainty. The men aboard the ships faced uncertainty every single day. They did not know whether they would find land, whether supplies would last, or whether they would ever see Spain again. Yet they continued sailing. That willingness to move forward, despite uncertainty, is one reason the expedition remains so memorable. Over time, the voyage became a symbol of human curiosity and ambition. Writers used it as an example of perseverance. Teachers used it to explain how exploration changed the world. Researchers examined surviving records to reconstruct what life was really like during the crossing. New details continue to emerge from historical studies, helping us understand the experiences of the crew more clearly. While many debates about Columbus focus on the consequences of his voyages, historians also remain fascinated by the practical challenge of the journey itself. Crossing the Atlantic in the 15th century was a remarkable achievement of navigation and endurance. The sailors relied on skills passed down through generations and on a deep understanding of wind, weather, and the sea. Their success demonstrated that oceans could connect distant lands rather than simply separate them. Once that lesson became clear, exploration accelerated across the globe. New routes were opened, new territories were mapped, and new opportunities appeared. The voyage of 1492, therefore, stands not only as a historical event, but also as a reminder of how determination and curiosity can drive people to attempt things that once seemed impossible, changing history in ways nobody could fully predict at the time. As historians examined the age of exploration more closely, they began paying greater attention to the ordinary sailors who travelled with Columbus. Most history books focus on famous leaders, but the voyage could not have happened without the crew. These men came from different backgrounds. Some were experienced seafarers who had spent years working on ships, while others joined because they needed money or hoped to improve their future. Life aboard the vessels was demanding from the moment the expedition left port. Sailors repaired sails, handled ropes, cleaned the decks, monitored supplies, and stood watch through long nights. Sleep was often limited, especially during rough weather. Food consisted mainly of preserved items that could survive months at sea. Fresh fruit and vegetables disappeared quickly, leaving crews dependent on dried foods and stored water. Despite these hardships, the sailors continued their duties because the survival of the expedition depended on teamwork. Every member of the crew played a role in keeping the ships moving safely across the ocean. Historians also note that many important discoveries throughout history were made not by a single individual, but by groups working together under difficult conditions. Columbus may have led the expedition, but the voyage itself was a collective effort. The famous sighting of land, for example, was made by a sailor scanning the horizon after weeks of searching. Such moments remind us that historical events are often shaped by many people, rather than one person alone. Over the centuries, researchers have tried to reconstruct daily life aboard the ships as accurately as possible by studying journals, records, and surviving accounts. They have built a clearer picture of the challenges faced during the crossing. The result is a story that feels more human and more relatable. Instead of seeing only great explorers and royal sponsors, we also see ordinary individuals confronting fear, uncertainty, exhaustion, and hope. Their experiences help explain why the voyage remains compelling today. It was not merely a geographical achievement, but also a test of endurance and determination. Every mile westward carried the expedition farther from the known world and deeper into uncertainty. Yet the ships continued forward. When land finally appeared, it marked the end of one challenge and the beginning of many others. That dramatic combination of risk, perseverance, and discovery is one reason the voyage of Columbus continues to capture the imagination of people around the world. More than 500 years after it first took place, the more historians studied Columbus and his era, the more they realised that the voyage of 1492 was part of a much larger story unfolding across Europe. during the 15th century. Kingdoms were becoming stronger. Trade networks were expanding, and new technologies were improving navigation. Shipbuilders designed vessels capable of travelling greater distances, while mapmakers gathered information from merchants and sailors returning from distant regions. Europe was entering a period of growing curiosity about the wider world. Rulers wanted new trade routes, merchants wanted new markets, and explorers wanted new opportunities. Columbus emerged from this environment. He was not the only person dreaming of long ocean voyages, but he became the one who successfully convinced powerful sponsors to support his plan. His journey reflected the ambitions of an entire age. When the expedition returned to Spain, it demonstrated that crossing the Atlantic was possible and potentially profitable. That lesson encouraged others to organise voyages of their own. Within a relatively short time, exploration became one of the defining activities of the era. Ports that had once focused mainly on regional trade began preparing ships for much longer journeys. Investors provided money for expeditions, hoping for valuable discoveries. Sailors gained experience navigating unfamiliar waters, and each voyage added new information to the growing body of geographical knowledge. What had once seemed mysterious slowly became better understood. Yet exploration remained dangerous. Storms, disease, shipwrecks, and shortages continued to threaten every expedition. Many voyages ended in failure or tragedy. This makes the success of Columbus's first crossing even more remarkable. The crew managed to travel across an ocean, locate land, and return with news that transformed how Europeans viewed the world. Historians often emphasize that people living at the time did not fully understand the significance of what was happening. They knew something important had occurred, but they could not foresee all the consequences that would follow over the next centuries. Looking back today, it is easier to recognize the voyage as a major turning point. It helped accelerate exploration, expand geographical knowledge, and connect distant regions more closely than ever before. The ships themselves have long since disappeared, but the impact of their journey remains visible in history books, museums, and classrooms around the world. Every generation continues to revisit the story, asking new questions and seeking a deeper understanding of what happened when a small fleet sailed westward into uncertainty and changed the course of history forever. By the early 16th century, the world that Columbus had known was already beginning to disappear. New expeditions were returning with reports of lands far larger than anyone had expected. Explorers sailed along coastlines stretching thousands of kilometres, proving that these territories could not simply be islands near Asia. Gradually, scholars and navigators accepted that an entirely different part of the world had been encountered. This realization was astonishing. For generations, Europeans had relied on ancient geographical ideas inherited from earlier civilizations. Now those ideas had to be revised. Maps were redrawn, books were updated, and debates filled royal courts and universities. The discoveries challenged long-held assumptions about the size and shape of the world. Columbus did not live long enough to see how dramatically geographical knowledge would expand after his voyages. But the process had already begun during his lifetime. New explorers followed routes across the Atlantic and pushed farther than before. Some searched for wealth, others for trade routes, and many simply wanted to uncover what remained unknown. Their reports revealed mountains, rivers, forests, and coastlines on a scale that surprised Europe. Each expedition added another piece to the puzzle. Historians often compare this period to the gradual assembly of a giant map whose edges were being filled in for the first time. Information arrived slowly, yet every voyage increased understanding. Sailors learned where currents flowed, where storms were common, and where safe harbours could be found. Navigation became more accurate as experience accumulated. The ocean that once seemed mysterious and frightening became a pathway linking continents. Columbus's crossing played an important role in that transformation because it demonstrated that regular travel across the Atlantic was achievable. Over time, ships carried not only explorers but also merchants, settlers, missionaries, and officials. Connections between distant regions became stronger year after year. Looking back, historians recognise that the voyage of 1492 was significant not because it answered every question, but because it created many new ones. People suddenly wanted to know what existed beyond every newly discovered coastline. Curiosity drove further exploration, and exploration produced even more curiosity. This cycle continued for generations. That is why the story of Columbus remains closely connected to the broader history of discovery. His expedition helped open a door that countless others would walk through afterward, transforming the way people understood the planet and their place within it. The world grew larger, more connected, and more complex because of journeys that began with a few ships sailing toward an uncertain horizon. As decades turned into centuries, the voyage of Columbus became more than a historical event. It became a symbol that different generations interpreted in different ways. During some periods, people focused primarily on the courage required to cross an unknown ocean. They admired the determination of sailors who ventured far beyond familiar waters and returned with news of lands previously unknown to most Europeans. During other periods, historians paid greater attention to the wider consequences that followed the voyages. They examined how exploration affected societies on both sides of the Atlantic, and how those changes shaped the modern world. Because of these different perspectives, the story of Columbus remained active in public discussion long after his death. Few historical figures have inspired so much debate across so many generations. Museums, universities, and researchers continued studying original documents in order to separate myth from reality. Some popular stories about Columbus were found to be exaggerated, while others were supported by historical evidence. The result was a more detailed and balanced understanding of the man and his era. Historians discovered that exploration was rarely simple. It involved ambition, competition, opportunity, risk, and uncertainty all at the same time. Columbus lived within this complicated world and reflected many of its characteristics. His achievements were significant, yet they were also connected to larger historical forces that extended beyond any single individual. Modern Technology has made it possible to reconstruct many aspects of the voyages with remarkable accuracy. Researchers study weather patterns, sailing routes, archaeological evidence, and surviving records to better understand what happened during the crossings. Some have even built replicas of the ships and sailed them across portions of the Atlantic to learn how they handled ocean conditions. These efforts reveal just how demanding the journey really was. The small wooden vessels faced powerful winds, towering waves, and months of uncertainty. Every successful crossing required skill and perseverance. When people today imagine the voyage, they often picture a few ships on a vast ocean beneath an endless sky. That image remains powerful because it represents one of humanity's oldest instincts, the desire to explore beyond what is known. Columbus and his crew were not the first explorers in history, nor would they be the last. But their journey occupies a special place because of the enormous influence it had on later events. The story continues to be told because it combines adventure with historical significance, reminding us that sometimes a voyage undertaken by a small group of people can have consequences that reach far beyond their own lifetime and echo across centuries. Another fascinating aspect of the Columbus story is how quickly information travelled after his return to Europe. Although communication in the 15th century was slow by modern standards, news of extraordinary discoveries spread surprisingly fast. Letters describing the voyage were copied, translated, and shared across different kingdoms. Merchants discussed the possibilities opened by the Atlantic route, while rulers considered how exploration might strengthen their power and influence. Scholars became curious about lands that did not appear on traditional maps. In a relatively short period, Columbus's journey transformed from a personal expedition into an event of international importance. People who had never seen the ocean heard stories about distant islands and unfamiliar cultures. Curiosity expanded alongside geographical knowledge. As more voyages followed, information accumulated rapidly. New maps displayed coastlines that had been unknown only years earlier. Ports welcomed ships returning with reports from across the Atlantic. Each expedition contributed additional details, helping Europeans build a clearer picture of the wider world. Historians often note that knowledge itself became one of the most valuable results of exploration. Gold and trade attracted attention, but information changed the way people understood geography, navigation, and the possibilities of travel. Columbus's voyage helped accelerate this process. It encouraged governments, merchants, and explorers to invest in further expeditions because they realized that the world contained far more opportunities and mysteries than previously imagined. Over time, exploration became a defining feature of the era. Young sailors trained in navigation, map-making improved, and ship technology continued advancing. The Atlantic Ocean, once regarded by many as a frightening barrier, became a route connecting different continents. This transformation did not happen overnight, but the voyage of 1492 played an important role in setting it in motion. Looking back from the modern world, it is easy to forget how uncertain everything seemed at the beginning. Columbus and his crew sailed without knowing what awaited them beyond the horizon. They could not predict the discoveries, challenges, and historical consequences that would follow. Yet their journey became one of the most studied expeditions in human history. More than 500 years later, books, documentaries, and historical research continue examining every aspect of the voyage. The reason is simple. It was not merely a story about reaching land. It was a story about changing perceptions, expanding knowledge, and opening connections between distant parts of the world. Few journeys have had such a lasting influence on how humanity understands the planet and its history. The legacy of Columbus also lives on through the countless places, monuments, books, and traditions connected to his name across different countries. Generations grew up hearing stories about the voyage and the ships that crossed the Atlantic. Some communities celebrated the expedition as a remarkable achievement in navigation and exploration. Others encouraged people to think more deeply about the consequences that followed, because history is often viewed through different perspectives. The discussion surrounding Columbus continued to evolve over time. This ongoing conversation is one reason his story remains relevant centuries after the events themselves. Historians are rarely satisfied with simple answers. Instead, they examine evidence, compare sources, and ask difficult questions about what happened and why it mattered. Columbus's voyages provide an ideal subject for such investigation because they touched so many aspects of history. They influenced geography, trade, politics, culture, and exploration. Few individuals are connected to such a wide range of historical developments. Modern archaeological discoveries have added new details to our understanding of the era. Excavations at early colonial sites, studies of ship construction, and analysis of historical records continue revealing information about daily life during the age of exploration. These discoveries help transform historical figures from distant names into real people, facing real challenges. They remind us that the famous voyage was carried out by sailors who experienced hunger, exhaustion, excitement, and fear just like people today would under similar circumstances. The Atlantic crossing was not an abstract historical event to them. It was their daily reality. Every sunrise brought uncertainty, and every sunset raised new questions about what lay ahead. Yet they continued onward, driven by hope, ambition, and curiosity. That human element is part of what makes the story endure. Beyond all the debates, statistics, and historical analysis, there remains a simple image that continues to capture the imagination. 3 ships moving steadily, westward across an endless ocean, toward a destination nobody could see. It is an image of exploration in its purest form. The sailors could not know how future generations would remember them, just as Columbus could not fully understand the long-term impact of his voyage. History would ultimately give their journey a significance far beyond anything they imagined. The world they left behind and the world that emerged afterward were not the same. In cette senza dev'amor, the crossing an ocean, it became a symbol of humanity's willingness to venture into the unknown and discover possibilities hidden beyond the horizon. Even today, standing on the shore, of the Atlantic Ocean can inspire thoughts about what Columbus and his crew experienced more than 5 centuries ago. Looking across the water, the horizon appears endless, just as it did in 1492. Modern ships, airplanes, satellites, and navigation systems have made global travel routine. But for the sailors of the 15th century, the ocean represented uncertainty on a scale that is difficult to imagine. They ventured into a world where mistakes could be fatal and where every decision carried serious consequences. Historians often emphasize that understanding the voyage requires placing ourselves in that historical context. We know how the story ends, but the people living through it did not. For them, the future remained unwritten. This uncertainty gives the voyage much of its dramatic power. Every day at sea presented new challenges, and every mile travelled west increased the distance from everything familiar. Yet the expedition continued. That persistence remains one of the most striking aspects of the story. Throughout history, major discoveries have often depended on individuals willing to continue despite doubt and uncertainty. Columbus's voyage fits within that larger pattern. Whether people admire him, criticize him, or hold a mixture of views, few deny that his journey played a significant role in shaping world history. The Atlantic crossing became one of the defining events of the age of exploration and influenced countless developments that followed. Researchers continue studying original records because they recognize how important the expedition was to understanding the transition from the medieval world to a more globally connected era. New generations of historians bring fresh perspectives, asking questions that earlier scholars might never have considered. As a result, the story continues evolving. History is not simply a collection of facts frozen in time. It is an ongoing effort to understand the past more completely. Columbus remains at the centre of many of those discussions because his voyages affected so many aspects of human history. Trade routes changed, geographical knowledge expanded, and interactions between distant societies increased dramatically. The consequences unfolded over centuries, influencing millions of lives. Few journeys can claim such a broad impact. As the story of Columbus continues to be studied, debated, and retold, it serves as a reminder that exploration is often about more than reaching a destination. It is about curiosity, ambition, risk, and the unpredictable ways in which a single voyage can alter the course of history. That is why the ships of 1490 to remain remembered long after the waves that carried them across the Atlantic have disappeared into the past. As the centuries moved forward, the story of Columbus became deeply woven into the larger narrative of global exploration. His voyage was followed by countless others that pushed beyond known boundaries and revealed just how vast the world truly was. Explorers crossed oceans, mapped coastlines, and connected regions that had previously existed in relative isolation from one another. Historians often describe this period as one of the greatest expansions of geographical knowledge in human history. The voyage of 1492 did not complete that process, but it helped accelerate it. Every new expedition added information, corrected mistakes, and expanded understanding. Maps became more detailed, navigation improved, and long-distance travel gradually became more reliable. The world that emerged from these developments was increasingly interconnected. Ideas, goods, technologies, and people moved across greater distances than ever before. Looking back, it is remarkable how much of this transformation can be traced to a time when sailors relied on little more than wind, stars, and determination. Columbus's story remains compelling because it stands at the beginning of that transformation. The voyage captures a moment when the future was uncertain and possibilities seemed endless. Historians continue returning to the story because it illustrates how historical change often begins with decisions that appear small at the time. A proposal presented to a royal court, a fleet prepared in a Spanish port, and a journey launched across an unfamiliar ocean eventually became part of a much larger chain of events. Those involved could not fully understand where the path would lead. They were focused on immediate goals such as reaching Asia, finding trade opportunities, and securing royal support. Yet history gave their actions a significance that extended far beyond those original objectives. This contrast between intention and outcome is one reason the voyage remains so fascinating. Columbus set out searching for one thing and encountered something entirely different. In doing so, he became connected to one of the most important turning points in world history. The expedition demonstrates how exploration can produce unexpected results and how discoveries sometimes emerge from mistaken assumptions. More than 500 years later, people still study the voyage because it represents a unique combination of ambition, uncertainty, courage, and consequence. It is a story about ships crossing an ocean, but it is also a story about humanity's desire to understand what lies beyond the horizon. That desire has driven explorers throughout history, and it continues to inspire curiosity even in the modern world, where many frontiers remain waiting to be explored. One final element that makes the story of Columbus so enduring is the way it connects the past with the present. When historians examine the voyage, they are not simply studying a man or a fleet of ships. They are exploring a moment when human understanding of the world began to change dramatically. Before the expedition, many regions of the globe remained unknown to most Europeans. Afterward, exploration accelerated and knowledge expanded at a pace that few could have imagined. The voyage became part of a broader movement that reshaped trade, communication, and geography. Modern society still reflects many of those changes. International travel, global trade networks, and cultural connections between continents all developed over centuries through processes that were influenced by the age of exploration. Columbus's journey occupies an important place within that history because it helped encourage further voyages across the Atlantic. Historians often remind us that no single person changes the world alone. Large historical transformations usually involve countless individuals, decisions, and circumstances working together. Columbus was one participant in a much larger story, yet his role remains significant because of the timing and impact of his voyage. The expedition occurred at a moment when new opportunities, technologies, and ambitions were beginning to reshape Europe. AS, or result. Its consequences spread far beyond the expectations of those who took part. Today, museums preserve artifacts from the era. Scholars analyse surviving records. And students continue learning about the voyage. The fact that interest remains strong after more than 500 years demonstrates the lasting importance of the event. Every generation revisits the story with new questions and perspectives. Some focus on navigation and exploration, others on cultural encounters and historical consequences. Together, these approaches create a richer understanding of the past. The voyage of Columbus endures because it contains elements that are universally human. Curiosity about the unknown, determination in the face of uncertainty, and the hope of discovering something beyond the horizon, whether viewed as an adventure, a historical turning point, or a subject of ongoing debate. It remains one of the most influential journeys ever undertaken. The small ships that left Spain in 1490 to disappear over the edge of the horizon. But the story they created continued travelling through time, carried from generation to generation, becoming one of the most discussed and remembered chapters in the history of exploration. Although the voyage ended centuries ago, historians still uncover new insights about Columbus and the world in which he lived. Libraries preserve copies of letters, journals, royal decrees, and reports written during the age of exploration. Each document provides another piece of the historical puzzle. Researchers compare these sources carefully because different. People often described the same events in different ways. Through this process, a more complete picture gradually emerges. We learn not only about Columbus himself, but also about the sailors, officials, merchants, and ordinary individuals whose lives were connected to the voyagers. History becomes richer when viewed through many perspectives rather than only one. This is one reason the story continues to attract attention from scholars around the world. It offers endless opportunities for investigation and interpretation. Some researchers focus on navigation, studying how sailors crossed vast oceans using limited technology. Others examine economic changes, cultural exchanges, or political developments connected to exploration. Every approach reveals something new about the era. The story of Columbus, therefore, serves as a gateway into a much larger history of discovery and global connection. It reminds us that major historical events are rarely isolated. Instead, they are linked to countless other developments unfolding at the same time. The Voyage of 1492 was connected to advances in shipbuilding, growing trade ambitions, political competition among kingdoms, and the curiosity that drove people to explore beyond familiar boundaries. All of these factors came together in a single moment that would influence centuries of history. Looking back today, it is easy to see the voyage as inevitable because we know what happened afterward. In reality, nothing about the outcome was guaranteed. The ships could have turned back. Storms could have destroyed them. Or support for the expedition could have disappeared before it even began. History often depends on uncertain choices and unpredictable events. That uncertainty is part of what makes the story so compelling. It reminds us that the people of the past faced challenges without knowing how their decisions would be remembered. Columbus and his crew sailed west searching for opportunity and discovery. They could not know that future generations would continue discussing their voyage more than 500 years later. Yet the journey endured in memory because it represented something larger than a simple crossing of the ocean. It symbolized humanity's willingness to seek answers beyond the limits of the known world and to continue moving forward even when the destination remained hidden beyond the horizon. As the modern era arrived, the world became increasingly connected in ways that would have seemed unbelievable to Columbus and his crew. Oceans that once required months to cross could eventually be travelled in days and later in hours. Maps became extraordinarily accurate, and satellites made it possible to observe nearly every corner of the planet. Yet despite all these advances, the Voyage of 1492 retained its place in history because it represented a moment when the boundaries of knowledge expanded dramatically. Historians often point out that exploration is not defined solely by technology. At its core, exploration begins with curiosity. It begins when someone asks what exists beyond the horizon and is willing to search for the answer. Columbus asked that question in his own way and pursued it with remarkable determination. His conclusions were not always correct, and many of his assumptions proved mistaken. But his willingness to attempt the journey helped shape future events. This combination of ambition and uncertainty is one reason the story continues to resonate with people today. The voyage also reminds us that history is filled with unexpected outcomes. Columbus believed he was searching for a western route to Asia. Instead, his expedition became associated with the opening of sustained contact between Europe and the Americas. The difference between what he intended and what actually occurred is one of the most striking aspects of the story. Historians frequently study such moments because they reveal how unpredictable the course of history can be. Small decisions sometimes produce enormous consequences that no one could have anticipated. The ships that departed Spain in 1492 carried only a few dozen men, yet their journey influenced events across continents and centuries. Few expeditions have left such a lasting mark on human history. Even now, discussions about Columbus continue because people recognize the significance of the voyage while also examining its broader consequences. Museums, books, documentaries, and academic studies ensure that new generations encounter the story and consider its meaning. Through these efforts, the voyage remains alive in public memory. More than 5 centuries after the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa María crossed the Atlantic, their journey still serves as a powerful example of exploration, uncertainty, and historical change. The world has changed beyond recognition since that time, but the fundamental human desire to discover what lies beyond the known horizon remains the same. In Zenzen the Story Barbast, it is also about the enduring curiosity that continues to drive humanity forward into new frontiers. Today, when people think about great voyages in history, the expedition of Columbus is often among the first that comes to mind. This is not simply because of the distance travelled or the fame of the explorer. It is because the journey occurred at a moment when the world was on the edge of profound change. The late 15th century was a time of growing ambition, expanding trade, and increasing curiosity about lands beyond familiar borders. Columbus's voyage became one of the events that helped transform that curiosity into action. Historians sometimes describe exploration as a chain reaction. One discovery inspires another, and each new voyage encourages further journeys. The expedition of 1492 played an important role in this process. It showed that the Atlantic could be crossed, and that new opportunities existed beyond the western horizon. As a result, explorers, merchants, and rulers became more willing to invest in long-distance travel. Over time, entire networks of routes connected continents that had previously been separated by vast oceans. The world became more interconnected than ever before. Yet the story also remains fascinating because it contains so many human elements. There is ambition in Columbus's determination to pursue his idea despite repeated rejection. There is courage in the sailors who agreed to cross unfamiliar waters. There is uncertainty in the long weeks spent searching for land. There is surprise in the discoveries that followed. And there is complexity in the consequences that unfolded afterward. Few historical events combine so many different themes in a single narrative. This richness helps explain why historians continue returning to the subject. Generation after generation. Every era asks different questions and finds new meanings in the story. Some focus on navigation, others on cultural encounters, and still others on the broader transformation of the world. Together, these perspectives reveal how significant the voyage truly was. The crossing of the Atlantic by 3 small ships became part of a larger historical process that reshaped geography, trade, and human understanding of the planet. More than 500 years later, the names of those ships remain known around the world. Their journey stands as a reminder that history is often shaped by individuals willing to venture beyond what is familiar, whether viewed through the lens of exploration, discovery, or historical change. The voyage of Columbus continues to occupy a unique place in the human story, demonstrating how a single expedition can leave an impact that echoes across centuries and influences generations far removed from the moment when it first occurred. The continuing interest in Columbus is also connected to the questions his story raises about how history should be remembered. Historical events are rarely simple, and the voyage of 1492 is no exception. As generations passed, people examined the expedition from different viewpoints. Some focused on the extraordinary challenge of crossing the Atlantic with limited technology. Others concentrated on the cultural and historical consequences that followed. Because of this, Columbus became one of the most discussed figures in world history. The debates themselves reveal something important about the study of the past. History is not only about memorizing dates and names. It is also about understanding why events mattered and how they influenced later generations. The story of Columbus encouraged people to think about exploration, ambition, leadership, and change. it also reminds us that historical actions often have consequences that extend far beyond the intentions of those involved. Columbus could not have predicted how future centuries would interpret his voyage. Like most people, he lived within the concerns of his own era. Yet the decisions he made became connected to developments that shaped the modern world. This contrast between personal goals and historical impact continues to fascinate researchers. The more historians learn about the voyage, the more they appreciate its complexity. It was neither a simple tale of triumph nor a straightforward story of discovery. It was a human event involving real people facing uncertainty, making choices, and responding to circumstances they did not fully understand. That complexity is one reason the story remains relevant today. It encourages us to look beyond simple explanations and explore the many factors that influence historical change. The voyage also serves as a reminder that the world is constantly evolving. At the time of Columbus, much of the globe remained unknown to Europeans. Today, maps cover nearly every region of the Earth. Yet, humanity continues exploring new frontiers in science, technology, and space. In many ways, the spirit of curiosity that drove explorers across oceans still exists. The tools have changed, but the desire to understand the unknown remains. This connection between past and present helps explain why the story continues to be told. More than 500 years after the voyage, people are still reading about it, discussing it and its significance. The journey survives in memory because it represents one of those rare moments when human curiosity, determination, and historical circumstance came together to produce an event whose influence extended far beyond the expectations of anyone who was there to witness it. Perhaps the greatest lesson that can be taken from the story of Columbus is how uncertain history appears to the people who are living it. When we look back at the past, major events often seem inevitable because we already know the outcome. But for Columbus and his crew, nothing was certain. They did not know whether they would find land, whether they would survive the journey, or whether their names would be remembered. Every decision carried risk. Every day at sea brought new challenges. The future remained hidden beyond the horizon just as completely as the distant coastline they hoped to find. This uncertainty is what makes the voyage feel so dramatic even after centuries have passed. It reminds us that history is created by people acting without knowledge of what comes next. Columbus believed he was searching for a route to Asia. The sailors believed they were participating in a difficult expedition. The rulers who funded the voyage hoped for economic and political advantages. None of them could fully predict the global consequences that would follow. Yet their actions became part of a chain of events that reshaped the world. Historians often study such moments because they demonstrate how individual choices can influence broader historical developments. At the same time, the voyage illustrates the importance of perseverance. Years of preparation, repeated rejection, and countless obstacles stood between Columbus and his goal. Many people would have abandoned the effort long before reaching the ocean. Instead, he continued pursuing his idea until an opportunity finally appeared. Whether one views him as a hero, a controversial figure, or something in between, That persistence remains a notable aspect of his story. The expedition also highlights the role of courage in exploration. The crew agreed to travel into waters that seemed mysterious and unpredictable. They faced storms, uncertainty, and fear, yet continued moving forward. Their experience reflects a broader human tendency to seek knowledge beyond the limits of what is already known. Throughout history, explorers, scientists, inventors, and travellers have shared that desire. It has driven humanity across oceans, through deserts, over mountains, and eventually into space. The voyage of Columbus belongs to that larger tradition of exploration. More than 500 years later, the journey continues to be remembered not only because of where the ships went, but because of what the voyage represents. It symbolises curiosity, determination, uncertainty, and the powerful impact that a single expedition can have on the course of history, leaving a legacy that continues to be examined and discussed by people around the world. As historians continue studying Columbus, they often return to a simple question: why does this story still matter after so many centuries? The answer lies partly in the extraordinary scale of its influence. Many voyages have been undertaken throughout history, but only a small number became turning points that altered how entire societies viewed the world. The expedition of 1492 was one of those rare moments. It arrived at a time when Europe was ready for greater exploration and when improvements in navigation made long-distance travel increasingly possible. Columbus's voyage did not create these conditions by itself, but it helped demonstrate what could be achieved within them. The success of the crossing encouraged further journeys and expanded the horizons of countless people who had never imagined such possibilities. Another reason the story remains important is that it illustrates the relationship between knowledge and discovery. Before the voyage, maps contained large uncertainties. Afterward, explorers began filling in those gaps with new information. Every expedition contributed to a growing understanding of geography. The process was gradual and often imperfect, but it transformed how people understood the planet. Columbus's journey became one chapter in that larger effort to expand human knowledge. Historians also value the story because it reveals the complexity of historical change. Important events rarely have only one cause or one consequence. The voyage was shaped by political ambitions, economic interests, technological developments, and personal determination. Its effects reached into trade, culture, migration, and international relations. Studying such an event helps us appreciate how interconnected history can be. A decision made in one place can influence lives far away and continue, affecting future generations. This is one of the reasons the expedition remains a popular subject in classrooms and historical research. It offers lessons not only about exploration, but also about the unpredictable nature of historical developments. Looking back today, the Atlantic crossing may appear inevitable, yet at the time it was anything but certain. Success depended on countless factors working together in just the right way. The story therefore serves as a reminder that history is shaped by both planning and chance, by determination and circumstance. more than 500 years later, people continue reading about Columbus because the voyage combines adventure with significance, personal ambition with global consequences, and uncertainty with discovery. It stands as one of those rare historical episodes that can be examined from many different perspectives while still retaining the power to capture the imagination of each new generation that encounters it. In more ways, the voyage of Columbus marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Before the expedition, large oceans often separated societies from one another. Information moved slowly, and many regions of the world remained distant mysteries. After the Atlantic crossing became more common, connections between continents increased steadily. These changes did not happen overnight, but the process had begun. Historians often describe the period that followed as a time of expanding horizons. People became more aware of lands, cultures, and opportunities beyond their traditional boundaries. Curiosity encouraged further exploration, and exploration produced new knowledge. This cycle repeated itself again and again, gradually transforming how people understood the world around them. Columbus's voyage became closely associated with this transformation because it helped demonstrate that distant oceans could be crossed and that new routes could be established. The significance of the journey therefore extends beyond the individual explorer. It is also connected to broader themes of discovery, communication, and change. One reason the story continues to attract attention is that it contains elements that are easy to relate to on a human level. There is the dream of achieving something that others consider impossible. There is the challenge of overcoming setbacks and doubt. There is the uncertainty of venturing into unfamiliar territory. And there is the realization that actions can have consequences far greater than expected. These themes appear throughout history and continue to resonate in the modern world. Whether people are exploring new scientific ideas, developing technologies, or pursuing ambitious goals, they often face similar questions about risk and possibility. The voyage of Columbus provides a historical example of what can happen when determination meets opportunity. Historians may disagree about various aspects of his legacy, but few dispute the importance of the events connected to his journeys. The expedition remains one of the defining episodes of the age of exploration because it influenced how continents interacted and how geographical knowledge developed. More than 5 centuries later, scholars still analyze documents, examine evidence, and debate interpretations. Such continued interest demonstrates the enduring importance of the story. The ships themselves vanished long ago, and the people who sailed aboard them are now distant figures from another age. Yet the voyage survives in historical memory because it represents a moment when the boundaries of the known world expanded and when a journey across an uncertain ocean became part of a much larger story about humanity's endless desire to explore, discover, and understand what lies beyond the horizon. As the story of Columbus is passed from one generation to the next, it continues to evolve alongside our understanding of history itself. Every generation asks new questions about the past. Earlier, historians often focused mainly on famous explorers and dramatic voyages. Modern historians tend to examine a wider range of perspectives. including the experiences of sailors, local communities, merchants, and political leaders. This broader approach helps create a more complete picture of the age in which Columbus lived, rather than viewing history as the achievement of a single individual. Researchers increasingly see it as the result of many people interacting within larger social and political systems. Columbus remains an important figure within that story, but he is also part of a wider network of events and influences that shaped the era. Understanding this complexity allows us to appreciate both the achievements and the consequences connected to the voyages. The continuing study of these events demonstrates that history is not fixed. New evidence can emerge, interpretations can change, and fresh perspectives can deepen our understanding. This process keeps historical discussions alive even centuries after the events themselves have ended. The Voyage of 1492 is a perfect example. Despite being one of the most studied expeditions in history, scholars still debate aspects of the journey and its significance. Such discussions reflect the richness of the historical record and the lasting importance of the subject. Beyond the academic debates, however, there remains a simple and powerful story that continues to capture people's imagination. A small fleet departed from Spain and sailed into an ocean that seemed endless. The crew faced uncertainty, fear, and enormous challenges. They crossed waters that many considered too dangerous or too mysterious to attempt. Against the odds, they reached land and returned with news that changed how many people viewed the world. That narrative of exploration and discovery remains compelling because it speaks to universal human experiences. Throughout history, people have ventured beyond familiar boundaries in search of opportunity, knowledge, or adventure. The voyage of Columbus reflects that enduring spirit. Whether discussed in classrooms, museums, books, or documentaries, the story continues to remind us that some of the most significant moments in history begin with individuals willing to take risks and pursue ideas that others doubt. It is this combination of uncertainty, determination, and historical consequence that has allowed the voyage to remain one of the most remembered and discussed chapters in the long history of human exploration. Looking back across more than 500 years, it is remarkable how a voyage that began with such limited expectations eventually became one of the most influential events in world history. Columbus did not set sail believing that future generations would study his life in schools, write books about his journeys, or debate his legacy across centuries. Like most people, he was focused on the goals directly in front of him. He wanted to find a western route to Asia, secure support from powerful rulers, and achieve success as an explorer. Yet history often moves in unexpected directions. The outcome of the voyage extended far beyond those original ambitions. This gap between intention and consequence is one of the reasons historians find the story so fascinating. It demonstrates how individual decisions can become connected to developments much larger than anyone originally imagined. The ships that crossed the Atlantic carried only a small crew, but the information they brought back influenced governments, merchants, explorers, and scholars throughout Europe. New expeditions followed, new maps were created, and new questions emerged about the world beyond familiar borders. Over time, these developments contributed to profound changes in global history. The story also reminds us that exploration is rarely a straightforward process. Success often involves uncertainty, setbacks, and unexpected discoveries. Columbus experienced all of these. He faced rejection before receiving support, encountered challenges during his voyages, and spent much of his life trying to achieve goals that remained just beyond reach. Yet despite these difficulties, his journeys became part of a historical transformation that reshaped geographical understanding. Modern readers may know the destination and the consequences, but the people living through the events did not. For them, every stage of the voyage represented a step into uncertainty. That uncertainty gives the story much of its enduring power. It allows us to imagine what it must have felt like to stand on the deck of a ship, surrounded by nothing but ocean, sailing toward a horizon that revealed no answers. More than 5 centuries later, that image remains one of the most recognizable symbols of exploration. It represents humanity's willingness to move beyond the known world in search of new possibilities, whether viewed through the lens of navigation, history, or human ambition. The voyage of Columbus continues to hold a unique place in the story of exploration, reminding us that some journeys become far more important than the people who first set out to undertake them ever expected. The longer historians study the voyage of Columbus, the clearer it becomes that its importance cannot be measured only by the distance travelled or the lands reached. The expedition mattered because it changed the way many people thought about the world. Before the voyage, geographical knowledge was more limited and many assumptions about distant regions remained untested. Afterward, curiosity increased dramatically. People wanted to know what existed beyond every coastline and beyond every horizon. Exploration became not just an occasional activity, but a major part of international competition and scientific interest. This shift in thinking may be one of the most lasting effects of the voyage. It encouraged generations of explorers to continue searching, mapping, and learning. Insistence de not merely about destination. It was about expanding possibilities. Historians often point out that major historical changes begin when people become willing to question old assumptions and investigate new ideas. Columbus's voyage contributed to such a process, whether intentionally or not. It encouraged others to look beyond accepted knowledge and seek answers through direct experience. This spirit of inquiry would later influence many other fields, including science, geography, and navigation. The age that followed became increasingly focused on discovery and observation. Ships crossed oceans, maps improved, and information circulated more widely than before. Although Columbus was only one participant in this broader transformation, his voyage became one of its most recognizable symbols. Today, people continue examining the expedition because it provides insight into how historical change occurs. It reveals the role of ambition, curiosity, technology, and chance in shaping human events. It also reminds us that history is often more complicated than simple stories of success or failure. The voyage contained elements of both. There were achievements, challenges, unexpected consequences, and ongoing debates about its meaning. This complexity is precisely what keeps the subject interesting. More than 5 centuries later, scholars still analyze documents, compare evidence, and discuss interpretations. The conversation continues because the voyage remains relevant to larger questions about exploration, human curiosity, and the ways in which the world became increasingly connected. As long as people remain interested in how societies change and how discoveries influence history, the story of Columbus will continue to be told. It endures not only because of what happened in 1492, but because of the many questions and discussions that the voyage continues to inspire long after the ships themselves disappeared into history. For many people, the story of Columbus ultimately becomes a story about the relationship between dreams and reality. Columbus dreamed of reaching Asia by sailing west. The reality he encountered was very different from what he expected. Yet it was precisely this unexpected outcome that gave the voyage its historical significance. History is filled with examples of people pursuing one objective and discovering something entirely different along the way. The Voyage of 1492 stands among the most famous examples of this phenomenon. Columbus searched for a route to known lands, but instead became associated with regions that were largely unknown to Europeans of his time. This unexpected result transformed the expedition from a navigational attempt into a major historical turning point. Historians often emphasize that many important discoveries occur in similar ways. Curiosity leads people toward one destination, but the journey itself reveals opportunities and realities they never anticipated. The story, therefore, carries lessons that extend beyond exploration. It highlights the importance of persistence, adaptability, and openness to the unexpected. Columbus's plans did not unfold exactly as he imagined, yet the voyage still changed history. The contrast between expectation and reality continues to fascinate readers because it feels deeply human. People in every era experience similar moments when their goals evolve because of new discoveries and unforeseen circumstances. This universal aspect of the story helps explain why it remains relevant centuries later. Beyond the historical details, there is also a broader theme of exploration that continues to resonate. Humanity has always been driven by a desire to understand what lies beyond current knowledge. Oceans, mountains, deserts, polar regions, and even outer space have all served as frontiers for exploration. The voyage of Columbus belongs to that larger tradition. It represents a moment when people chose to move beyond familiar limits and seek answers in the unknown. Such moments often shape the future in ways that are impossible to predict. The sailors aboard the ships could not know how their journey would be remembered. They could not foresee the debates, studies, books, and discussions that would continue hundreds of years later. Yet their voyage became part of a historical narrative much larger than themselves. That enduring significance is why historians continue studying the expedition and why audiences continue listening to the story. It remains one of history's most powerful examples of how curiosity, determination, and unexpected discoveries can combine to influence the course of human events across generations and continents. As we move toward the final chapters of the Columbus story, it becomes clear that his greatest legacy was not a specific island, a particular voyage, or even a single discovery. His greatest legacy was helping to open an era in which people increasingly viewed the world as a place that could be explored, mapped, and understood. Before the age of exploration, vast distances separated many societies from one another. Information travelled slowly, and knowledge of distant regions was often limited. After voyages such as those led by Columbus, those distances began to feel smaller. Oceans remained enormous, but they no longer seemed impossible barriers. Ships travelled back and forth more frequently, carrying goods, ideas, and people across great stretches of water. This process gradually changed the world. Historians often describe such moments as turning points because they influence many different aspects of society at the same time. Columbus's voyage became one of those moments. The significance of the journey was not limited to what happened during a few months at sea. Its influence extended into the centuries that followed. New routes were established, new maps were created, and new generations of explorers were inspired to continue searching beyond known boundaries. The voyage became part of a larger movement that reshaped how people thought about geography and connection. Yet what makes the story especially memorable is that it began with uncertainty. No one aboard the ships knew exactly what would happen. They faced risks that are difficult to imagine today. Their success was never guaranteed. Every day brought new challenges and new reasons to doubt. Nevertheless, they continued forward. This combination of uncertainty and determination gives the story much of its lasting appeal. It reminds us that major historical changes often begin with people who are willing to pursue ideas despite uncertainty. Columbus's voyage illustrates how curiosity and persistence can influence events far beyond their original purpose. More than 500 years later, the story continues to be studied because it represents a moment when the known world seemed to expand. Historians may debate different aspects of the voyage, but they generally agree that it played an important role in shaping subsequent history. The expedition became part of a chain of events that connected continents more closely than ever before. Its impact reached across generations, influencing trade, exploration, and geographical understanding. That is why the voyage remains such an enduring subject of interest. It is not merely a story about ships crossing an ocean. It is a story about how human curiosity can alter the course of history and leave a legacy that continues long after the voyage itself has ended. When people imagine Columbus today, they often picture him standing at the front of a ship, looking toward an unknown horizon. Whether or not such a scene happened exactly that way, the image has endured because it captures the essence of exploration. A horizon represents possibility. It marks the boundary between what is known and what remains undiscovered. For Columbus and his crew, the Atlantic Ocean was filled with such horizons. Each day they sailed toward answers that remained hidden beyond sight. This sense of uncertainty is one reason the story continues to resonate. Human beings have always been drawn toward mysteries. We want to know what lies beyond the mountain, across the ocean, or outside the limits of current knowledge. The Voyage of 1492 became one expression of that universal curiosity. Historians often note that exploration is not simply a matter of geography. It is also a way of thinking. Explorers question assumptions, challenge accepted limits, and seek information where none previously existed. Columbus embodied some of these qualities. He was willing to pursue an idea that many people doubted and to invest years of effort into making it possible. Although his understanding of geography contained serious errors, his determination remained strong. The result was a journey that became one of the defining events of its era. Over the centuries, the voyage inspired countless books, paintings, articles, and discussions. It became part of the collective memory of many societies. Some people focused on the navigational achievement, while others examined the broader consequences that followed. Both perspectives contributed to the ongoing fascination with the story. Historical events that continue, generating discussion after hundreds of years, are relatively rare. The Voyage of Columbus belongs to that category because its impact extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of the expedition. It influenced exploration, geography, and international connections in ways that continue to be studied today. More importantly, it serves as a reminder that history is often shaped by people who choose to move beyond familiar boundaries. The sailors who crossed the Atlantic could not know how future generations would remember them. They were focused on surviving the voyage and reaching their destination. Yet their actions became part of a larger historical narrative that stretched across centuries. That enduring connection between individual choices and long-term historical change is one of the reasons the story remains so powerful. It demonstrates how a single journey, undertaken in search of opportunity and knowledge, can leave an influence that lasts far longer than anyone involved could ever have imagined. Another reason the voyage of Columbus remains memorable is that it occurred during a period when the world was becoming increasingly interconnected. Trade routes already linked parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa, but many regions remained separated by great distances and limited knowledge. The Atlantic crossing helped create new connections that would grow stronger over time. Historians often describe history as a network of relationships, rather than a collection of isolated events. The Voyage of 1492 fits this idea perfectly because its effects spread outward in many directions. What began as a single expedition eventually influenced commerce, navigation, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. The process unfolded gradually, yet its impact proved lasting. Looking back, it is remarkable how much change followed from a voyage undertaken by a relatively small fleet. The ships themselves were modest compared with modern vessels. Their crews were limited in number. Their resources were finite. Yet history repeatedly shows that the size of an event does not always determine its significance. Sometimes a small expedition can have consequences far beyond its immediate scale. Columbus's journey is one of the clearest examples. historians continue examining the voyage because it reveals how interconnected historical developments can be. Political ambitions, economic interests, technological innovations, and individual determination all played a role. None of these factors alone explains the outcome. Together, however, they created the conditions that made the expedition possible. This complexity helps explain why the story remains relevant. It encourages people to think about how historical change actually occurs. Major transformations rarely result from a single cause. Instead, they emerge from the interaction of many different forces. The Voyage of Columbus provides a valuable case study in this process. It shows how ideas, opportunities, and circumstances can combine to produce results that exceed anyone's expectations. More than 500 years later, historians still find new ways to interpret and understand the event. That continued interest reflects the enduring significance of the voyage. The ships crossed an ocean, but the consequences reached much farther. They extended into future generations, influencing the development of societies and the understanding of geography. The story survives because it represents more than a journey from one shore to another. It represents a moment when the world began to feel larger, more connected, and filled with possibilities that had previously remained beyond the limits of imagination. That sense of discovery continues to captivate audiences today, ensuring that the voyage remains one of the most studied and remembered episodes in the history of exploration. As the years became centuries and the centuries became history, the voyage of Christopher Columbus continued sailing through human memory. The ships themselves vanished long ago. Their wooden hulls disappeared. Their sails were folded for the last time. And the sailors who crossed the Atlantic returned to dust like every generation before them. Yet the story endured. It endured because it represented something larger than a single man or a single voyage. It represented humanity's endless desire to look beyond the horizon and ask, what might exist on the other side? When Columbus left Spain in 1492, he could not know that people more than 500 years later would still be talking about his journey. He could not know that historians would spend lifetimes studying his letters, his maps, and his decisions. He could not know that schoolchildren around the world would learn his name, or that museums would preserve pieces of the era in which he lived. Like everyone else, he was simply living one day at a time, making choices without knowing how history would judge them. The Atlantic Ocean that seemed so vast and mysterious to Columbus remains there today. Waves still roll across its surface just as they did centuries ago. The stars that guided sailors across the sea still shine in the night sky. Yet the world has changed dramatically. What was once unknown has been mapped. What was once distant has become connected. What was once a dangerous voyage lasting months can now be completed in hours. The world grew smaller in distance but larger in understanding. That is perhaps why the story continues to fascinate people. It reminds us that every generation faces its own unknown horizons. Not all of them are oceans. Some are ideas waiting to be explored, questions waiting to be answered, and dreams waiting to be pursued. The courage required to move toward those horizons remains the same. History remembers explorers not because they knew exactly what would happen, but because they were willing to continue forward despite uncertainty. The voyage of Christopher Columbus was filled with ambition, mistakes, courage, hardship, hope, and unexpected consequences. It changed lives during his own time and influenced countless generations afterward. Historians may continue debating different parts of his legacy, but one fact remains clear. The journey became one of the most influential voyages ever undertaken. And so, as the sun sets over the Atlantic and the distant horizon fades into darkness, the story finally comes to an end. The Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa María disappear into history once more, carried away by the winds of time. Yet their voyage is never truly forgotten, because it became part of the larger story of humanity itself, a story of curiosity, discovery, and the timeless desire to sail beyond the edge of the known world in search of what lies beyond.